joining us. My name is Jennifer Lazo. I'm an emergency services coordinator for the city of Berkeley. So I work in the fire department's office of emergency services. And this is Amy.
I am the LHMP, or Local Hazard Mitigation Plan Coordinator in the Office of Emergency Services.
Yeah. And so we received from Shallon a variety of questions that, from this commission. And I just want to offer that we are here to sort of divide those questions up. Today, we're going to discuss the local hazard mitigation plan, and at your invitation, I would be very happy to come back in a month and talk about the emergency plan for the city, the Community Resilience Center, preparedness programs, the things that are beyond mitigation. I'm happy to talk about any of that in the next one. The mitigation plan, as you'll learn, has a very specific timeline, and so that is what we needed to bring to you today. But I'm happy to come back and have a longer discussion about the disaster planning and preparedness of the city as a whole, and where your commission may have a role. So just wanted to give that introduction.
So just for our own process context, there's a day we've heard about, which is February 28th.
Correct.
And commissions are asked to give feedback on the plan.
Correct.
So this is our last meeting before that date.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a challenge for us to figure out what we want to do. I understand it's not the last opportunity to give input in the year, because there's a flow of conversations that's going to be happening.
And we're going to only discuss the plan that needs the feedback. So everything else is not a part of this plan.
So is the plan that whole document that's 300 pages? There's a
Yes.
lot in there.
Yes,
Yeah.
there is.
And
And Jamie's going to give you a
where's the
summary of
dividing
it.
line between that and everything else? If you could just
We'll
clarify
describe that
Yeah.
a little bit into this presentation, and if you have any remaining questions, I'm here to sort of say, yes, that's part of the plan, or no, I'll come back and we can discuss it later. All right, cool.
Okay, again, my name is Jamie Albrecht. I am the LHMP Coordinator for the City of Berkeley's Office of Emergency Services. As of April of last year, I've been helping to co-project manage the 2019 update to the local hazard mitigation plan. So I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about the plan and why we're updating it, and give a little bit of overview, and so you can talk to you about how you can give feedback and then answer any questions you may have. So the agenda for tonight's presentation, I'll go over the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan, or LHMP for short, sorry for the acronyms, talk a little bit about the plan, why we're updating it, and kind of how it fits into other city plans. Jennifer will talk a little bit about what is hazard mitigation, so kind of this conversation here about what is preparedness and what is mitigation. And then I'll go over some of the objectives we had for the first draft of the plan beyond meeting a federal requirement, and then go through some of the key aspects of the first draft plan, and then go through an overview of how to provide feedback, and then also the adoption and approval process. So the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan is an appendix to the safety element of the city's general plan. It was adopted in 2004, one of the first of its kind in the country, so yay Berkeley. And then council adopted an update again in 2014. This is a federal requirement that you update the plan every 5 years, and there are financial incentives to do this and to keep it up to date. So with an up-to-date plan, you remain eligible for federal mitigation grant funding. We use some of that funding right now to retrofit city buildings. It also makes you eligible for post-disaster recovery money. So if a big earthquake hit the state, we would be eligible for the state to cover the costs that the city would normally be forced to front. The update to the plan has been going on since early 2018, and it's been up for public review since December 18th, and you can comment through February 28th. Part of the federal requirements is that it has two kind of main key elements. One is the hazard analysis, which goes through all of the hazards that could happen in Berkeley, where they might happen, and what our vulnerabilities are. So our people, our infrastructure, what could be impacted by the hazards that may happen here. And then part C, the mitigation strategy, which are actions that the city is proposing that we will do or we would like to do if we had more funding or more resources to address the hazards and how we might mitigate them. So Jennifer's going to talk about hazard mitigation.
All right, so hazard mitigation is one of the 4 key elements of the disaster cycle of emergency management. The other ones are preparedness, response, and recovery. So disaster preparedness and mitigation are not the same thing, and they're actually very easy to confuse. So I just want to make sure that we all are on the same page as we begin this discussion about the plan. So mitigation's goal is to reduce or eliminate the impacts of a disaster. And so the goal of mitigation overall is through passive elements to try to keep a disaster from being as bad as it could be. A really good example of that is building retrofit. We know that earthquakes happen. You'll hear quite a bit more about them from Jamie in a minute. And by retrofitting a building, adding a steel frame to the outside, you keep the building from ever collapsing in the earthquake. So nobody has to turn on a switch or do any action to make this building safe once the earthquake starts. It is passively already safe. While preparedness is an element of increasing the emergency response capability. So you see, this is a preparedness example that we actually do at Oregon Park Apartments, teaching people how to use fire extinguishers. The fire already has to be there and hurting things for preparedness to be useful. Mitigation happens to try to prevent the building from collapsing in the first place. Preparedness teaches people how to rescue people out of that building and treat them when they're injured. So you're going to see some examples as we go through this of what it looks like between these two things. Really good mitigation examples: strengthening structures, which we've already discussed, making land use decisions that minimize damage. So this is one of the big mitigation actions. If people aren't in the area of highest hazard, if they don't live there, then they won't be injured in that area, right? So moving people out of an area of hazard. Reducing vegetation in high fire areas. So if the fire can never jump to a large vegetation area, then we don't get a wildfire, right? Or strapping down water heaters. This is one of those ones that is a mitigation action because it prevents a gas leak from happening during an earthquake. It can happen and no one, again, is turning on a switch to start this action. When the earthquake happens, it's passively occurring. This is compared to preparedness. So all of these are preparedness elements, and this is what I would be happy to come back and talk to you about in a future meeting. But none of these preparedness elements are part of the plan we're going to be discussing today. So purchasing equipment to use an emergency response is a preparedness action because it's for during the response when something bad has already happened. Conducting disaster response drills is a preparedness action. It's about what you do during the response. The storage of disaster supplies is a preparedness action. It means something bad has happened and you need to use those supplies. And then finally, writing plans about how to respond to a disaster is a preparedness action. So it's not covered under the plan that is under discussion today. So is everyone okay with that, just quickly? Because this is a key element. All right, Jamie, it's all you.
Thanks. So as I mentioned, one of the main pieces of this plan is meeting a federal requirement and remaining eligible for lots of funding, which is really great. This city core project team and our external partners kind of came together with some other guiding objectives for the plan beyond meeting this requirement. I'll kind of summarize them here. So first one, to reduce the potential for loss of life, injury, and economic damage from all of the hazards that we're going to talk about next and their secondary impacts. To increase the city government's ability to serve the community during and after hazardous events by mitigating risk to key city functions. To preserve Berkeley's unique character and values from being compromised by hazardous events. To connect with residents, community-based organizations, institutions, businesses, and essential lifeline systems in order to increase mitigation actions and disaster resilience. And then to protect Berkeley's historically underserved populations from the impacts of hazardous events by applying an equity focus to mitigation efforts. These were some of our guiding objectives. We, of course, welcome all of your input on kind of how we brought these throughout the plan, and hope you'll send feedback if there are edits you would like to see. So getting into our hazard analysis and strategy updates, which are kind of the key pieces of the plan. So this is a hazard analysis summary slide of earthquake and wildland urban interface fire are our hazards of greatest concern because of their likelihood of occurring in Berkeley and the severity of their impacts. This plan also addresses rainfall-triggered landslides, floods, and tsunamis. The federal government sort of requires that this plan focus on naturally occurring hazards. However, we also include some man-made hazards that we think kind of exacerbate the natural hazards of concern. So climate change, we know with climate change, this exacerbates all of our other hazards and kind of makes things more varied, our weather more varied. Extreme heat is new this year, and recognizing we had kind of some extreme heat days in Berkeley, and we're not so used to that. We have people who are very vulnerable to to heat, so we added that this year, and recognizing with climate change we might see more of that. And then hazardous materials release, knowing that disasters may cause hazardous materials to be released by accident. So starting with earthquakes, we kind of wanted to go over what can happen, what kind of impacts we're looking at from an earthquake. So this slide includes kind of 2 scenario earthquakes. Scenarios are used a lot in emergency management or kind of disaster planning to think about, okay, if we had this type of earthquake, like a hypothetical earthquake, what would it look like? So we can start to plan, how we might mitigate some of the impacts. So in 2004, this HAZUS word is a federal software that you can use, and you can input in the magnitude of the earthquake, where it might be epicentered, and then it spits out sort of what you could expect, what type of impact. So Berkeley did this in 2004. So these are some of the impacts that are associated with a 6.9 earthquake epicentered in Berkeley. So that's kind of outdated, so those numbers might look a little small to you. Obviously Berkeley has changed a lot since 2004, so those might be pretty conservative. The Hayward scenario is the United States Geological Survey did this in 2018, but the impacts that you see to buildings, displaced households, fires, water outages, these are regional impacts, and that earthquake scenario is a hypothetical 7.0 earthquake epicentered in Oakland. So not focused on Berkeley, but it can kind of give you a sense of what type of damage that an earthquake of that magnitude that people are saying we might expect in coming years would do to our area and maybe into Berkeley. So thinking about these impacts, I'm going to talk next about some of the actions that address building damage or buildings and so on. So first action we have is around city-owned buildings, kind of going back to that guiding objective where we need to maintain our services in the event of a disaster. So building assessment is related to kind of understanding the risks that our buildings pose, our city-owned buildings, and then strengthening and replacing the ones that are most critical to providing services to community members. So we also have a suite of actions dedicated to privately owned structures. There are a variety of them for soft story buildings. So this map shows every hazardous, all the hazardous buildings known in Berkeley right now. There are a lot of them. So this is kind of trying to address those buildings one by one in a variety of programs. So we have soft story, maintaining that program. Unreinforced masonry buildings, maintaining that program to kind of help owners either retrofit their building via grants. That's the retrofit grants program. And then this research ordinance is kind of a new thought in building and safety to sort of see, okay, there might be other buildings in Berkeley that we haven't thought of before that are we're seeing vulnerabilities in Southern California, so let's do a little more digging around what other buildings we should be aware of in Berkeley, maybe expand our inventory. And then the last one is sort of updating building codes to make sure that we have really stringent codes and make sure we're keeping our buildings safe in the event of an earthquake. Streamline rebuild is kind of outside of mitigation in the sense that it is kind of making a faster permitting zoning process to kind of speed up. If something were to happen, we had to have a process in place to help us rebuild quickly. So it's not strictly mitigation, but it's getting us ready for if something were to happen, we would be a little bit more ready to build back up. So as shown also in that impact sheet of those 2 earthquakes, our utilities are also at risk. So some of the ways to address that is energy assurance, so that's sort of thinking about backup plans in the event that the power goes out. So looking for new ways to have power, sort of solar and battery operated. And then kind of exploring new ways to have different types of energy that we might be able to use going forward. Gas safety is around we have a gas shut-off valve program that if there's an earthquake, it'll shut the gas off so that that you don't even have the issue in the first place. So we have a program for that if you complete some preparedness steps, you can get one of those in your house. This action also is sort of investigating other ways of moving to electrification and kind of not having the gas in the first place. East Bay Mud, sort of coordinating with East Bay Mud on making sure that we have water for fighting post-earthquake fires, but then also sort of resources for potable water in the event of an earthquake. And then undergrounding is an idea that is kind of a long, lengthy, expensive process, but some work has been done even since 2004 when the plan was first released, and kind of wanting to acknowledge that some of this work is going on, and there are, I think, 3 projects underway, 2 with like 20A funding, and some private property owners are doing some undergrounding. So our next hazard of greatest concern is the wildland urban interface fire. The area in the Berkeley Hills, kind of shown here on the map, is kind of ripe for wildland fires because of kind of our hot Diablo winds. We have dense vegetation, mountainous topography, this cleverly named spaghetti street situation, where the streets are super windy and you can't turn around. So it's kind of an area ripe for fire. So, and it is difficult to get up there for first responders. So that's kind of the panoramic hill area is the area deep in red because there's only one way in, one way out, so it's kind of the most dangerous area in Berkeley. The sort of yellow-orange is Berkeley's fire zone 2, so it kind of covers all of the hills. And then the area, the outline in red is the state of California's designated high severity fire zone. So just keeping in mind that that's our area of most concern with fires. We have some past events in Berkeley that are probably maybe familiar to a lot of people. So knowing that this is a very real thing that we could face, and if we had something like this now with the amount of development, it would probably involve a lot more structures. So, so we have kind of a suite of mitigating fire risk. So fire mitigation is creating our fire code to have like pretty stringent rules or vegetation management programs. So having more funding to help property owners be able to clear fuel from their properties, and then also figuring out ways we could do more inspections. So if we could have more people out there kind of seeing and helping people assess their vegetation situation. Then there's evacuation, kind of knowing that the hills roads are those spaghetti streets, making sure that they are cleared, exploring some parking strategies that might make it easier to get in and out, and then working with the Berkeley Pathwinders on their paths for pedestrian ways of evacuating. Air quality is a new action that has never been in the plan before. It came as a result of nearby fires sort of impacting the air quality this year for many of our residents. And it was kind of tricky to find a mitigation action that kind of made sense for this. So this is really around figuring out what buildings in Berkeley we could direct our residents to go in the event that we have really poor air quality, and having that in place before a situation like that happens again. We also have active landslides in the hills. So rainfall triggered landslides do come up. So buildings and infrastructure at risk. This is a map of active landslides in the Berkeley Hills. And most hillside development does predate best practices and codes for landslide mitigation, so there are some risks up there. There are kind of similar actions around gas safety and building codes as in earthquake. The severe storm one is focused around finishing up our watershed management plan and really targeting stormwater management systems to make sure that we're fixing the ones first that present the most problems. So Berkeley has a moderate flood risk due to creek flooding and storm drain overflow from our really aging infrastructure. So again, focusing on the watershed management plan and finishing that up. And then with climate change and sea level rise, we may see our flood risk in Berkeley become greater than just what's considered a moderate flood risk. with this, again, severe storm, kind of same action with landslides, focusing on kind of targeting parts of our stormwater system that need the most repair, and then maintaining participation in the federal government's National Flood Insurance Program. Berkeley is also at risk for tsunamis. There was significant marina damage from the 2011 Japan tsunami. And in that neighborhood, we have a lot of vulnerable people, buildings, infrastructure, roadways, and businesses. And we're kind of learning more and more about Berkeley's tsunami risk each passing year. So this map shows very recent inundation scenarios where we're seeing in kind of targeted evacuation guidance. So we incorporated that into this plan, and we have an action in the plan that is associated around really protecting our marina community and repairing docks and things that have fallen into disrepair, and then making sure that the streets that are part of these evacuation zones are clear so that it would be easier to evacuate folks if necessary. Climate change, so one of our man-made hazards, kind of a suite of things could happen with climate change, increasing temperatures and heat waves, more severe storms, kind of this variety of weather that we haven't experienced before, the extremes, sea level rise, increased drought, and all of these things really go into exacerbating all of the hazards mentioned before in a way that we can't be quite sure of. So there's a suite of climate change actions. Climate change integration refers to really making climate change a part of city operations, so really thinking about it when we make our decisions. Water security is working with East Bay Mud and thinking about how we can be more efficient and conserve our water resources. Sea level rise is sort of monitoring that latest science and making better land use decisions and working that into our process. Severe storms, as I mentioned, is also related to targeting our stormwater drainage systems. And then extreme heat I will address soon. Extreme heat events. So I don't know if many people remember we had a few hot days in the last, I don't remember what it was, but in the last year for sure. So in Berkeley, it's considered a heat wave when you have 5 or more days with temperatures over 88 degrees, which doesn't seem, to many people, probably not from here, it doesn't seem very high, but as a community not very familiar with really high temperature days, and we don't have the building infrastructure to keep people cool in some parts of Berkeley. So this map is a map of our tree canopy, and as you can see, the hills have great tree canopy, but then in West Berkeley and South Berkeley, we don't have that kind of natural cooling feature. So this presents really bad public health risks and infrastructure impacts, and with climate change, we're only going to see more of these. So really thinking about how can we make sure that, so the extreme heat action is really thinking about how can we provide more shading to West and South Berkeley, and thinking about where we could direct people to go in the event that there are extreme heat days that are kind of spread throughout the city. Extreme heat events also impact air quality, so again, having that information about where we could direct people to go if the air quality and extreme heat, both of those things are happening at once. And then hazardous materials release. This map shows what's considered level 1 hazardous materials sites, and also very concentrated in West Berkeley and their transportation routes. So these are ones with like really extreme, very high levels of hazardous materials. If we mapped every hazardous material in Berkeley, it would be, you would have gas stations and things like that. So this is really extreme ones. Hazardous materials release could be a secondary impact of a natural hazard. So this action is really around the city maintaining inspection of these and enforcement programs so that we can make sure that all of this transportation of hazardous materials in these sites are safe. I think that is all then. You made it with me. That was a lot of hazards. So for next steps of kind of what, and this is sort of an overview of how this plan works. So the core project team, which is a bunch of people from various divisions and departments across the city, have been working previously. We released the first draft on December 18th. So that February 28th deadline is the feedback deadline for the first draft plan, so it's kind of in this stage now. We're bringing it to various commissions. It's online for public comment. It's at public libraries. So we're going to take all of that in and address public feedback and also work in commission feedback. And then once we do that, it will get sent to the California Office of Emergency Services and the California Board of Forestry. They will check the boxes. They're sort of the gatekeepers between us and FEMA. They'll go through and kind of see if we did everything that was mitigation and not preparedness, and then let us know. And then we will incorporate their feedback and then send it to FEMA, who will look at it, go through their process, and then they will, if they like it, will issue us what's called approval pending adoption. So then we have to kind of take it through our council approval process. So we will get a kind of a final draft plan, which incorporates commission and community feedback, state feedback, federal feedback. We'll release this final draft plan, and then it will go to the Planning Commission and the Disaster and Fire Safety Commission, and they'll have public hearings on it to vote and sort of recommend to City Council, hopefully by December 2019, so that we don't fall out of regulation, and then it will go back to FEMA when it has been adopted. I should just say that it goes to planning and disaster and fire safety. As I mentioned earlier, it is a part of the general plan, which is why planning plays a significant role in the adoption process, and then disaster and fire safety charged with sort of reviewing city documents on these topics and kind of being the home of the plan. They also are a key part of the final adoption process. So if you would like to comment on the plan, it is available online at cityofberkeley.info/mitigation. There are physical copies of it at the city library, and yeah, the deadline is February 28th. You can email me, it will be me, at mitigation@cityofberkeley.info. You can also drop it off at the fire department, at the public safety building, or send it via mail. Thank you, and can you hopefully answer questions?
Just what your name was again and your position.
I am Jamie Albrecht, and I'm the LHMP coordinator at the Office of Emergency Services.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, just to, for the process, I think our charter is social justice, so that's what I think that the city would be looking at us to comment on. Having said that, I don't want to restrict any questions or comments or things people need clarified or what you want to talk about, but we have maybe half hour, 45 minutes. I think we can make good progress, but let's try to focus on that. Go ahead, Dan.
I just wanted to, I don't know exactly how this can be done, but I know that our neighborhood has, enough people have gone to the trainings and have done everything, so we have neighborhood caches and we have cluster caches and we have the cache that was given to us by the fire department. But we all noticed, when those of us that went to the trainings, which are very interesting, I think I said this before, but I just want to emphasize it, that it's pretty much kind of Hill people and kind of white people at those trainings. And so I would suggest perhaps really pushing the council members and the staff and to go out into the neighborhoods and get more people to do those trainings. They're on Saturday mornings, so it doesn't interfere with a lot of with everybody's work days. So just, and in terms of the social justice focus, that it's really important to get to the whole city. You know?
So the one thing I will just add is we too noticed that pattern, and the Community Resilience Center program was made to address that pattern. It is focused on South and West Berkeley, and we've brought the classes into South and West Berkeley at times and in locations that are easier to reach. So next meeting, I'm happy to discuss. That was really an equity-based program, and I think it goes into a lot of those issues, and we'd be happy to discuss it. But it's on, again, the preparedness and
It's
response
already
side.
there, okay.
Oh, it's on preparedness.
Yeah.
I was wondering about communication for the same group of people. Is that mitigation or is that preparedness? Like, how do we reach certain people and And when you go by West Oakland, there's so many VCRs and streets and things, and is there a timing place for that?
It's also in the preparedness and response side. And there's a variety of methods that we use. I don't wanna leave, again, want to let you discuss, but don't wanna leave you hanging, that we really focus on multiple methods and multiple ways of reaching our audiences. So we have many emergency alerting methods that use everything from social media to AC Alert, which is Alameda County's emergency alert and warning system. It can send you a text, an email, a phone call. You choose how you want to receive the message and in what order. We also use radio. We have an emergency radio station that anyone can tune into and listen to in Berkeley. We use the website. We use any number of things. And again, back to the Community Resilience Center program, we use that program to talk to organizations that reach out to communities that we may not be as familiar with and ask them to push the messages through those organizations. So.
Considering the news about PG&E and both the bankruptcy, but also the various incidents of fire, the San Mateo explosion, how much looking at mitigation relative to loss of energy, but also the impact of possibly a bankrupt agency that's providing the resources in there. And the second question is about Sutter Hospital, which is supposedly is closing and the only emergency room that is available. So is that included in the discussion for emergency preparedness, and what are the alternative plans? Rather than wait for an earthquake to happen and we don't have a hospital, and then we ask the question, what happened then? So those two.
Yeah. I'll let Jamie start with the utilities.
About PG&E.
Well, just for example, do we have any gas lines, and are these tested? Are we looking at where they're located? What is the testing mechanism? Are we warning people where they are at? Because again, PG&E is going to say we did our testing with what happened in terms of the legal case against them by San Mateo. So is that part of the investigation as we prepare this emergency?
We definitely have mapped all of the pipelines and things like that, and work very closely with them, but
How close?
So we had a tabletop exercise with them about 6 months ago to look at what a major gas leak on Shattuck would look like, and the Berkeley High School was there as well. I think they made it. I think there's a publicly available after action report from that exercise. So it is something that we're discussing with them, and part of this update and part of our next time I'll come with the wildfire evacuation plan as well. There is a discussion of PG&E's shutoff plan for when there's significant fire weather that they're shutting off. We do know what they're shutting off and what that could impact. So there's only so much any one city can tell an organization around the Bay Area what to do, but we do communicate constantly with them about what hazards are in Berkeley and what we can do to address those hazards. And then question 2, the hospital question is actually a question I'm going to defer to the fire department. It's not as much in the Office of Emergency Services, but I know the fire department has done an emergency medical services report about the impact on ambulance arrival time and things like that for the hospital no longer being there. So I can look up that report and provide it and share it with the group. So, but it's outside of the scope of this particular plan.
Yeah, I guess we could do a workshop style and allow folks to join in.
Okay, so I've heard this a couple times. I've scanned the entire mitigation plan, and I've seriously read half of it. It focuses heavily on earthquake, and from attending the fire safety and disaster, looking at what's happening with climate change, I would say that our wildland urban interface is our biggest, most urgent hazard. I would suggest that all of you really sit down and read this, as grueling as that may seem and feel. But this is a really important document and plan to think about seriously and get through. So I wanted to make that comment. We really need to look at fire, and especially after talking to our Fire Chief Brannigan, which is what I put in the Daily Planet this weekend, is that Wildcat Canyon fire could wipe out all of Kensington in 8 minutes. And he commented, yeah, we could lose Berkeley in an hour. This means that you're not going to be able to walk out of a fire from the hills using the pathways. I mean, we really need to seriously plan mitigations and how we're going to do this. On to climate change. Unfortunately, I didn't make Dar Jamal's speaking engagement on Thursday night. I've been listening to some of his podcasts, and also the geological scientist Harold Wainless. And when I listened to Dar Jamal's podcast, was an interview on Martin Luther King Day. I repeated this like 3 times. I kept replaying it because he gave the formula for sea level rise from Harold Wainless. So the formula for sea level rise is for each 100 parts per million of increased carbon. This is from studying our planet. That's 100 feet of sea level rise. We're looking at 130 feet. How fast that's going to happen, none of us know. But we're looking at serious sea level rise, not 4 feet, 6 feet, 2 feet. We really need to put that into the system. We have exceeded the worst predictions of the IPCC because that is a group writing of that IPCC paper, so it's been on the conservative side. We really have serious mitigation to think about and to plan for and to adapt to. And I sound kind of like an alarmist, but you know, I've been looking at this stuff for quite a while and seriously and trying to follow. There's so much information out there on climate change. It's really hard to absorb it all, but we really, climate change and fire, that is, we'll get our earthquake at some point. We don't know exactly when, but fire is really, really seriously upon us.
One thing I'll mention, I would say if you have any comments on the climate change section or references you think should be in the plan, please submit them as written and we'll look through those.
Yeah, I was going to say the priority level of the hazards and the priority level of the actions, all of that is up for change. So please do submit, and I'm happy to incorporate edits.
I will. I mean, there's only a few pages on fire, and it really should be the whole thing. So,
and the one thing I wanted to address for the wildfire plan is tomorrow City Council is having a special meeting in which Chief Brannigan will be doing a very long and detailed presentation on the wildfire threat here in Berkeley. It involves not just the mitigation plan, but also our new wildfire evacuation draft annex and other programs. So all of the materials are already online, and I highly recommend tuning in if that's something that's of interest.
Those materials are 1,500 pages.
Yeah, I would say about 1,300 of those pages is the full version of the local hazard mitigation plan. It's a really big document. That I'm like looking at this going, oh, that's not the full
Oh, the
plan.
300 pages that I read, that's
still,
a summary of
yes.
a summary. It's executive summary.
It's a very big plan.
So, we'll call Igor, and then I want to raise a few other
Oh, I
points.
think we have Angie too.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see her.
It's up to you. Okay. Really quick, this is the second time I've heard this presentation since he also came to the Housing Commission, and that's where I provided the more in-depth comments, so this is going to be high level. First of all, I have to agree with Dr. Bazian's comments. Can I call you Dr. Bazian? I recognize that the fire department is looking into the possible elimination of Alta Bates Hospital. I understand that the entire force of the city is working with the county and state right now to prevent that from happening, and the fire department is on it. But I really encourage you to not look at it in silos, but integrate it into this mitigation plan as well. It's certainly part of the mitigation response. In terms of the streamline rebuilding, that is something that I haven't seen before in this presentation. And I wanted to ask if this has anything to do with the panoply of recommendations that staff has gotten from council and several commissions, including the Disaster and Fire Safety Commission, also the Housing Commission, about what would happen if disaster strikes and naturally occurring affordable housing is destroyed and people are displaced, and how do we rebuild? Undergrounding, I was really interested in hearing more. I know that this is a priority of the city right now, as is electrification. And in fact, I know thanks to the leadership of council members Davila and Harrison, there is going to be a presentation or a workshop on electrification coming up soon. I wanted to see if the move towards electrification is something that is provided high level or otherwise in this plan. In terms of I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the risk assessments, moderate, high, low, are subject to change. If you could speak a little bit to how things like sea level rise became moderate in the first place. That was the same question I asked a few weeks ago at the last presentation. Is it qualitative or quantitative in nature how you determine the risk levels? I personally agree with Kelly that sea level rise will likely be a high risk in the end, but only data will show what it actually is. So I was curious if there's a methodology that you use. The city has recently declared a climate change emergency. I had a question about how, if, and to what extent this is integrated into the toolbox that is being developed right now, both by members of the council and by community organizations, about what can be done to avert a climate change emergency. Kelly, you mentioned that you may be alarmist, but I think the science agrees with you that we have a very narrow window of time to avert this. Lastly, I wanted to talk about equity, and second, a comment that has been mentioned. I think so I'm really glad to hear that in terms of the disaster preparedness programs, there's now more focus being done in West and South Berkeley, and the flats in general. But even things like the canopy cover, which you showed a map of, I live in the part of West Berkeley that is going to be the first to flood. It's going to, if there is a major disaster, we're in a local hazard mitigation area. There are a lot of industrial sites. Those would be the perfect candidates for more effort to plant trees and do other things that could provide that mitigation. I'm curious how this plan might tie into that. And finally, public input and engagement. I really appreciate and applaud you for going to the various commissions to do this. And I think I can't remember if you did this much effort 5 years ago when the last one came out, but this is phenomenal. I have not, however, seen enough information about this to the public at large. I'm wondering if this information has been provided on Nextdoor and through other mechanisms that are available to the city, community organizations. it would be great if the public knows that they can write in by February 28th at 5 p.m. And it's also important for the public to know that those comments will be read and they might not be responded to, but that there will be a comprehensive look at everything that's submitted and how does it get that information on the back end.
They'll be responded to.
Every comment will be
By
responded to.
me.
So lots of questions there, and I think we definitely encourage you to submit them in writing as well, so we can respond to all of them, because there's a lot. The things I will mention right now is the tree canopy issue actually is also going to be discussed by Chief Brannigan tomorrow. A proposal of looking at that concept of increasing the density of the tree canopy in South and West Berkeley, while we may have to do some thinning up in the hills to reduce the wildfire threat. So that's one of the discussions tomorrow night that I think you'll want to see. Streamlined rebuilding.
I don't know if that comes from, I think I'm pretty sure it was in the 2014 update to the plan as well. So I don't know kind of the genesis of like where the idea came from and how it ended up there. But I mean, it's great if it is meeting a need that other people were asking for. It was in the old plan, and then it's been something on the minds of folks to keep working on. So, but I don't know the history of it.
And then I would say that as you talk about some of the climate change things, our goal in working with this large group has been to really try to look at, as we do a project, something like the North Berkeley Senior Center retrofit. The reason we can look at that building at all is because it's a disaster care site and it needs an earthquake retrofit, but we tend to take those opportunities to add in things that will make it a greener building, a more sound building, more useful building for the community. So we find a lot of the mitigation plan resources that become available once we have this plan enable us to look holistically.
Climate action plans, but those kind of, and we worked with the Office of, what is it, Sustainability, I always mess it up,
Sustainability.
Yes, crushing it. So we worked with them very closely to integrate all of their research and work into the plan, and this is kind of considered like in the family of the climate action plan, but many plans for many things.
I think that's a big step.
So I had a question about the process for retrofitting private buildings to be seismically safe. It says here that low-income housing units are more vulnerable to earthquake damage. Is that something that's included in the plan when we talk about like which private buildings are retrofitted first? Like are they prioritized?
That's a great question. Those programs are managed by Building and Safety, and so I don't know if there's kind of a priority structure, but it's a really good question. So you should definitely email me. Yeah,
and I would follow that up with a lot of it is actually requirements that have been placed onto building owners with timelines as to when they have to retrofit their building. But an incredible resource that's available to everyone today is on the website right now. You can go and look up the address of soft story buildings and see where they are in the retrofit status. And I encourage, I'm a renter, any renter in the city to look at that list and check your building and see where it is. We try to empower the community to have this information. We don't want to keep it secret.
And I think we owe that part to Igor.
In part, but the good news is that I think close to 95% of multi-unit soft story buildings, 5 units or more, is how that's defined, have either been retrofitted if they're on the soft story list or are in the process of being retrofitted. The question remains what can be done about the 4 units or less buildings now.
yeah.
So I wanna throw in a few things I've been thinking about. Basically, I have 4 issues that have mostly been brought up by other people. But one is how to enhance disaster preparedness from a community-centered rather than simply government-centered perspective. That's 1. 2 is about some issues about equity. 3 is treatment of the coming climate catastrophe. And then 4, there's some other issues I don't think are addressed. I do understand that you're making a distinction between mitigation and preparedness, and that's probably because of the federal requirements. But it is a little tough for maybe lay people to say, oh, I better not talk about this because it's not really mitigation. Where's the line? So I'm just gonna throw some things up because frankly it's all related. I feel, having read it and from the presentation, like your objective D is to connect with residents and community-based organizations and so forth in order to increase mitigation actions and disaster resilience in the community. And you're talking about that, and we're talking about communication, but there's a difference between a communication that's kind of one way and really the engagement of the community in the effort. And you know, probably from a government perspective, you might be frustrated that people aren't rushing to your door to say, we want to be involved in this really thing that may happen someday. But it's like, so there's been this conversation happening over the last several years about urban shield, which is different. But what the folks who are saying, we don't like that militarization, and we don't like that racism and all these things about urban shield, and that they also don't like that it's so heavily law enforcement focused. Now your presentation is not law enforcement focused, so it's closer to what people have been looking for. But in the process of that conversation, they've come up with some principles that I think would be useful. So Stop Urban Shield is a coalition that says 3 things. Some solutions, such as knowing one's neighbors, protect against multiple grave harms and disasters, including earthquakes and fires. Knowing your neighbors, like knowing who on your block is disabled, who's going to have trouble getting out, who's seniors, elder, who has little kids. We are so isolated from each other that to even think on those terms is a real stretch. But frankly, yeah, and they say government agencies and communities themselves must recognize the necessary role of community members as the actual first responders in emergencies. And that local neighborhood cohesion is key to weathering emergencies and should be systematically supported and developed. That's kind of a different approach. This approach is kind of government-centric and it's kind of technical, and I think and traditional. And I think maybe we can help in putting together some suggestions. So I would look for other folks who are interested in putting together, and it can't really be stamped by the commission because we're not meeting before February 28th. But I would highly recommend this analysis by Oxfam America of the Cuban model. And in Cuba, without going into a lot, they had 700,000 people in Cuba who were victims of just one hurricane, and they have them all the time. Hurricane Michelle, only 4 or 5 people died. A very, very poor country because they're so heavily organized on a grassroots and block by block level, and everybody knows everybody, and they just do it. So that's like, that would be interesting to look at that model. And this is a way to look at the question of what social model without dwelling in the kind of the sterile kind of ideological debates, because it's a really concrete thing we're talking about. So that's one. I think it could use help in that direction. And is that mitigation? I think it's everything.
So I think there could definitely be some mitigation elements to it, and any recommendations you have along that especially specifically address things in the plan, as you look at the actions, I would say, there may be places where you can see opportunities for that. I was just thinking of one of the actions that is addressed in there right now, which is a partnership we have with Easy Does It Emergency Services. They provide disability services in the city, and the city helped them. They recently received a $30,000 Christopher Reeves Foundation grant to literally do things like strapping down water. I'm losing words now too. Water in people's homes, people with disabilities. They're going into homes and doing mitigation activities in the homes, and so we've been partnering with them on things like that. So I think you'll see some actions, and I think we could certainly look for more opportunities for those actions, but I'll say a lot of the discussion of neighborhoods and the strength and power we absolutely acknowledge in Berkeley and is more in the preparedness realm, and I would be happy to discuss the suite of programs that we offer in that realm next when I come back in a month or two, whenever you want me back. And I think you'll see a lot of discussion of the neighborhood first responder is your neighbor model. We've addressed that in a variety of ways, but we're always open to suggestions of other ways to look at it. So we'd be very happy to hear it.
So that's one. The second one is about equity, and I noticed that there's a line that appears many times. Of course, maybe it's in the 1500 page. I don't know, but the objective is protect Berkeley's historically underserved populations from the impacts of hazardous events by applying an equity focus to mitigation efforts. And then I never saw any more detail than that. No. But I did look in a different document, which was the Climate Action Plan. And I saw that there was which goes back to 2009, I think, and there was a initiative that was passed, or a measure, supporting this document. And then there was an update last year, which I'd never read any of this stuff, but it was interesting. You've got a few different equity analyses and equity and climate adaptation training, but there's specifically a Berkeley Climate Action Coalition, which is a partnership with the Ecology Center. And I'm just gonna read a little of what they say in that document. Highlighting the voices of marginalized populations. Topics have included climate refugees, smart and just growth, activism to stop refinery expansion in African American and Latino communities, the health and climate justice nexus, green jobs, urban agriculture in food deserts, equity and climate adaptation, and intergenerational climate action and community organizing. And I just read that and I thought, wouldn't it be great if that was in this plan? So that's related to the first point. I would love to see more of that, even in the mitigation section.
Yeah.
And then the climate catastrophe, I appreciate that it's addressed, and you know, and then it comes home to Berkeley, and we're trying to think globally and act locally, but and you even talk about vectors, you know, insects, but it really is focused, what I read, mostly on sea level rise and on the effect on basically Igor, you know, on up to 5th Street in a worst case scenario. The problem is, what is the bigger picture? The bigger picture is that we're not in isolation. I mean, obviously we're not in isolation from the sea, but we're also like, it's not that hard to, okay, this goes back to what Kelly was saying, it's not that hard to look at what's going to be happening nationally and globally, which is that, and I saw that you had a space where you're trying to, you say we have to do some training and we have to do some study and research within the city government to understand better what's going to be coming. But you know, if we're talking about potentially billions of climate refugees, what's Berkeley going to look like in 50 years? With a smaller space and potentially, to throw out a number, doubling the population and all of the new people being homeless. How do you, it goes into the response and the recovery, but all these, as a project manager, I know all these phases are integrated, right? You can't really look at them in isolation. What kind of society are we going to have then? Can we look at this from a social perspective as well as a technological one? And you know, we're not just talking about 2100. The impact will be felt much sooner. So I would love to see a more comprehensive look. I guess that's my theme. A more comprehensive look at what is we as a city do to prepare for this catastrophe. And the answers are not only technical, but they're social, and the impacts are political, racial, gender, all the bad things that are happening now already without a climate disaster are gonna be like out of control. So again, that's maybe something that we can talk about and sit down and talk with you about. Enough for now.
That's great.
Again, we encourage you to submit the comments, so, and there will be, the process is you will actually be able to see every comment and every response to them and where in the plan that comment is either addressed or discussed, so even if, I will admit, I personally have not read all 1,100, 1,500 pages. Jamie knows them all, and she will find the page if it's somewhere in there, so we'll do the search for you.
I just wanted to follow up on Igor. The electrification workshop is this week on Thursday from 3 o'clock until 8 o'clock at the Ed Roberts campus. And you can find more detail under the Ecology Center or 350 Bay Area. It's also mentioned in the activist calendar in the Berkeley Daily Planet. So there are some sources, and they do recommend pre-registration. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Other comments, questions?
Just a quick question. What are the means by which you have been disseminating this information to the public? And if we wanted to amplify the message, to read this and submit comments by February 28th at 5 p.m., what is the best way that we can do so?
We've sent the link and information on how to submit comments to, I think, every listserv. Both we have, like, every contact, every point of contact we have, and public health, and all of our, like, organizations who are in the community. We've sort of sent it to everyone we know, and it's on the website. I think you can, as a person here, you could submit or let the world know any way that you choose to let the world know.
I think we're going to look at this, it depends on the calendar of the city, but there is an opportunity to also do the full press release next to our cycle, and I think we talked about it, there's some craziness around the holidays about getting it out, but there's still an opportunity there that would be easily shareable by anyone, but we're also happy to share the email we already sent to our partners so that it's easy to send to everybody.
What else? Is anyone interested in doing some work on the side on this? Doing some writing, as group writing? Just let me know if anything. Okay, and you're at Mitigation at the City of Berkeley, don't you?
Correct.
I guess both of you there?
Yeah, we'll go check it. And if you want me back, just to talk about preparedness and response and everything else we said wasn't part of this plan, I'm happy to return at your request when you want me. I understand if there's only so much disaster at a time that you want to address. I get
Would
that
have
too.
to wait until next year? Or?
No, it's an entirely different topic. It has nothing to do with this specific plan, and we are in the ongoing process of reviewing, for example, our wildfire evacuation plan is in draft form and is being reviewed by lots of partners right now, so we'd be happy to discuss it.
Great.